To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, we'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Warning. The late October sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as Jackson Vincent hefted another box from the moving truck. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the crisp autumn air. Their new neighbor, Thaddeus Pollard, had moved in just 3 days ago, and Jackson believed in being neighborly. His wife Tasha had volunteered them both to help, though she'd mysteriously disappeared 20 minutes into the move, claiming she needed to check on something at home. "Dad, can we go?" 9-year-old Bo Vincent tugged at Jackson's sleeve for the third time in 10 minutes. The boy had been increasingly agitated since they'd started helping, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by nervous glances toward the house's dark windows. "Just a few more boxes, son," Jackson replied, wiping his hands on his jeans. At 38, Jackson maintained the lean, muscular build of his military days. 2 tours in Afghanistan had taught him patience, attention to detail, and when something felt wrong. Right now, watching Bo's behavior, something definitely felt wrong. Thaddeus emerged from the house, his pale complexion and sunken eyes making him appear older than his stated 45 years. "Appreciate this more than you know, Jackson." Not many neighbors would give up their Saturday. "No problem at all." Jackson studied the man's nervous mannerisms, the way his eyes darted away during conversation, how his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. Military instincts died hard. Bo suddenly grabbed Jackson's arm with surprising force. "Dad, we need to go? Now." The urgency in his son's voice cut through Jackson's neighborly obligations. Bo was mature for his age, not given to dramatics or childish fears. If something was bothering him this much, "All right, buddy. Let me just tell Mr. Pollard we're heading out." "I'll wait by the truck," Bo said quickly, already backing away from the house. Jackson found Thaddeus in the garage, hunched over a large cardboard box that seemed to contain old electronics. "We're going to call it a day, Thaddeus. Bo's not feeling well." Of course. Thaddeus straightened too quickly, nearly knocking over the box. "Thanks again for everything." The walk back to their house 2 doors down felt longer than usual. Bo stayed close to Jackson's side, occasionally glancing back at Thaddeus's place. The moment they stepped inside, Bo's composure cracked. "Lock all the windows. Close the curtains," he shouted, racing through the house. Jackson followed, bewildered. "Bo, what's wrong?" His son was yanking curtains closed with desperate efficiency. "Didn't you notice anything?" "Notice what?" Bo's voice dropped to a trembling whisper. "In that house, Dad, there were pictures on his desk. Lots of them." "Pictures of what?" "Kids, Dad. Pictures of kids from our school. From our neighborhood." Bo's face had gone pale. And there were pictures of Mom. Recent ones. Ones where she didn't know someone was taking them." Jackson's blood turned to ice. His military training kicked in immediately. Assess, analyze, act. "Are you sure about what you saw?" "I saw them when I helped him carry that box to his office. They were spread all over his desk like he was studying them." The implications hit Jackson like a physical blow. A predator, living 2 doors down, watching his family, watching his son, watching his wife. A slow, deliberate knock echoed through the house. Jackson and Bo froze. 3 more knocks, patient and rhythmic. "Don't answer it," Bo whispered. Jackson moved to the front window, peering carefully through a gap in the curtains. Thaddeus stood on their porch, his pale face illuminated by the porch light. But there was something different about his posture now, more confident, almost predatory. The nervous, grateful neighbor act had vanished. The knocking came again, followed by Thaddeus's voice. "Jackson, I think your boy dropped something at my place. Something important." Jackson's hand instinctively moved to where his sidearm would have been during his Army days. He'd kept weapons in the house, locked away but accessible. Right now, he wished one was closer. "What do we do?" Bo whispered. Jackson pulled his phone from his pocket, but hesitated. "Call the police and say what? That his 9-year-old saw some pictures? That their new neighbor gave them bad feelings?" He needed more than suspicions. "We wait," Jackson said quietly. "And we watch." The knocking stopped. Through the curtain, Jackson saw Thaddeus return to his house, but the man's casual pace suggested this was far from over. That night, Jackson didn't sleep. He sat in his darkened living room, watching Thaddeus's house through a crack in the blinds. Light moved behind the windows until nearly 3 a.m. Whatever their neighbor was doing, It required a lot of attention. Around dawn, Jackson made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find out exactly who Thaddeus Pollard really was. And if the man posed any threat to his family, to any family, Jackson would handle it the way he'd learned to handle threats in Afghanistan. Permanently. But first, he had questions that needed answers. Starting with why his wife had been so eager to volunteer their help, then disappeared so quickly. Starting with how Thaddeus had gotten those pictures of Tasha. Jackson Vincent had spent years protecting people from dangerous predators in foreign countries. Now it seemed he'd have to do the same job in his own neighborhood. He was ready for that war. Chapter 2. Foundations of Betrayal. Jackson Vincent had met Tasha Wilkins 5 years ago at a Veterans Affairs benefit dinner in downtown Chicago. She was volunteering, serving meals to returning soldiers, her warm smile and attentive nature drawing him like a beacon after years of darkness. At 33, she possessed the kind of effortless beauty that turned heads. Auburn hair, green eyes, and a laugh that could fill any room. For Jackson, emerging from the psychological minefield of 2 combat tours, she represented everything good about the world he'd fought to protect. Their courtship was swift and intense. Tasha seemed fascinated by his military background, asking endless questions about his experiences, his training, his mindset. She claimed to admire his strength, his unwavering moral code, his protective instincts. Within 8 months, they were married in a small ceremony attended by Jackson's Army buddies and Tasha's extensive family. The early years were good. Tasha embraced her role as stepmother to Bo, Jackson's son from a previous relationship that had ended when his ex-wife couldn't handle the reality of military life. Bo's mother had abandoned them when he was 3, leaving Jackson to raise the boy alone during his final years of service. Tasha seemed to genuinely care for Bo, and the boy had warmed to her gradually. Jackson had used his military benefits to complete a degree in computer security, landing a well-paying job with a defense contractor. They'd bought the house on Maple Street, planted roots, built what appeared to be a stable, happy life. Jackson thought he'd finally found peace. But Tasha had always been restless. She worked part-time at a local art gallery, claiming she needed creative fulfillment beyond domestic life. She'd started taking evening classes in photography and digital arts. She joined a book club, a hiking group, a wine-tasting society. Jackson had encouraged it all, believing a happy wife made a happy home. What he hadn't realized was that Tasha's outgoing nature masked a deep dissatisfaction with their quiet suburban life. She'd grown up in a chaotic household with 4 siblings, constant drama, and ever-changing relationships. The stability Jackson provided felt suffocating to her. She craved excitement, passion, unpredictability, everything that Jackson's carefully ordered world couldn't provide. Donovan Mendoza had entered their lives 6 months ago as the new photography instructor at the community center where Tasha took her evening classes. At 35, he was everything Jackson wasn't: spontaneous, artistic, emotionally volatile. Where Jackson was methodical and controlled, Donovan was impulsive and intense. Where Jackson spoke carefully and precisely, Donovan was expressive and dramatic. Donovan had grown up in Los Angeles, the son of a successful architect and a former model. He'd attended expensive art schools, traveled extensively, lived the bohemian lifestyle that Tasha had only dreamed about. His photography focused on capturing raw human emotion, which required long, intimate sessions with his subjects. Sessions that often extended well beyond the classroom. The affair had started as emotional infidelity, late-night conversations about art and life, text messages that gradually became more personal, coffee meetings that turned into lunch dates. Tasha told herself she was just exploring her creative side, that it meant nothing. But Donovan understood her in ways that Jackson never had. He saw her as an artist, a free spirit, a woman with untapped potential. Jackson saw her as his wife, his partner, his responsibility to protect and provide for. The physical relationship began 3 months ago. Tasha justified it as a temporary madness, something she would end once she sorted through her feelings. But Donovan was addictive, his passion, his creativity, his complete focus on her when they were together. With him, she felt alive in ways she'd forgotten were possible. Jackson, meanwhile, had thrown himself into his work and his role as Bo's father. His job required frequent travel, consulting on security systems for military installations. He trusted Tasha completely, never questioning her explanations for late nights or weekend gallery events. His military mindset viewed marriage as a mission requiring loyalty, commitment, and unwavering support. The possibility of betrayal simply didn't exist in his worldview. But Jackson's training had also taught him to notice details, patterns, changes in behavior. Over the past month, he'd registered subtle shifts in Tasha's demeanor. She was more animated after her photography classes. She paid more attention to her appearance, bought new clothes, changed her perfume. She'd become protective of her phone, taking it to the bathroom, sleeping with it under her pillow. Jackson had filed these observations away without consciously analyzing them. His trust in Tasha ran too deep for immediate suspicion. But now, sitting in his darkened living room watching Thaddeus Pollard's house, those observations took on new significance. How had Thaddeus gotten those pictures of Tasha? The professional quality Bo had described suggested they weren't random snapshots. Someone with photography skills had taken them. Someone who knew Tasha's routines, her favorite places, her schedule. Someone like Donovan Mendoza. Jackson opened his laptop and began researching their new neighbor. Military intelligence training had taught him how to dig deep, how to connect seemingly unrelated information. What he found in the next 2 hours would shatter his carefully constructed world. Thaddeus Pollard didn't exist. Not officially. The name was an alias, poorly constructed and easily penetrated by someone with Jackson's skills and security clearances. The real man was Eric Cameron, a disgraced private investigator who'd lost his license 3 years ago for illegal surveillance and blackmail operations. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Someone had hired Eric to watch Tasha, to document her affair, to build a case. But who? And why? Jackson's hands trembled as he dug deeper into Eric Cameron's background. The man specialized in extramarital investigations, gathering evidence for divorce proceedings. His methods were questionable, his ethics non-existent, but his results were thorough and legally admissible, which meant someone wanted evidence of Tasha's affair. Someone with enough money to hire a professional investigator. Someone who planned to use that evidence against her. Against them both. Jackson's military mind shifted into tactical mode. He was facing multiple enemies with unknown objectives. His wife was compromised. His family was under surveillance. His home was no longer secure. But Jackson Vincent had survived worse situations with fewer resources. He'd learned long ago that the best defense was a devastating offense. Time to go to war. Chapter 3. The Truth Revealed. Jackson spent the next 2 days conducting his own surveillance operation. He took vacation time from work, told Tasha he was fighting off a virus, and sent Bo to stay with his brother Wade for the week. With the house to himself, Jackson transformed into the intelligence operative he'd once been. He installed hidden cameras throughout their home, monitored Tasha's phone calls, and tracked her movements using GPS software he'd developed for military applications. He also began following Eric Cameron, learning the fake neighbor's patterns and discovering the scope of his surveillance operation. What Jackson uncovered exceeded his worst expectations. Eric had been watching their family for 3 months. His house contained sophisticated surveillance equipment, professional photography gear, and detailed files on every member of their household. But the most damaging discovery was a collection of videos and photographs documenting Tasha's affair with Donovan Mendoza in explicit detail. Jackson sat in his home office, staring at images that destroyed 20 years of trust and 5 years of marriage. Tasha and Donovan in hotel rooms. Tasha and Donovan in his downtown loft. Tasha and Donovan in places Jackson recognized, their favorite restaurant, the park where they'd been married, even their own home during one of Jackson's business trips. But the betrayal went deeper than adultery. Jackson found evidence that Tasha and Donovan had been planning their future together, discussing how to maximize their financial gain from ending her marriage. Text messages revealed their strategy, established grounds for divorce based on Jackson's supposed emotional unavailability and PTSD issues, claim half of his assets, and ongoing alimony. Then start fresh with Donovan in California. They'd already consulted lawyers. They'd already opened joint bank accounts. They'd already looked at apartments in Los Angeles. The rage that filled Jackson was unlike anything he'd experienced, even in combat. This wasn't the heat of battle or the adrenaline of survival. This was cold, calculated fury born of profound betrayal by the person he'd trusted most. But Jackson was a strategist first, a soldier second. Rage without planning was just destruction. Rage with purpose was warfare. He needed to understand who had hired Eric Cameron. The answer came through financial records that Jackson accessed using skills the Army had taught him for intelligence gathering. The payments came from a private account belonging to Leonore Briggs, Tasha's lawyer. Tasha hadn't just been planning to leave him. She'd been building a legal case to destroy him. The surveillance was intended to document his behavior, looking for evidence of anger, instability, or violence that could be used against him in divorce proceedings. They wanted to paint him as a dangerous veteran, unfit for custody of Beau, undeserving of his assets. Jackson's hands clenched into fists as he read the legal strategy documents Eric had collected. They planned to claim Jackson was abusive, that his military background made him unstable, that Tasha feared for her safety. They would use his own protective instincts against him, twisting his love for his family into evidence of controlling behavior. The final betrayal came in a recorded phone conversation between Tasha and her lawyer, discussing how to handle Beau. Tasha wanted nothing to do with raising Jackson's son once the divorce was finalized. She saw Beau as an inconvenience, a reminder of her failed marriage, someone else's responsibility. Jackson had given this woman everything. His trust, his love, his protection. He'd opened his home to her, shared his son with her, built a life around making her happy. And she'd repaid him by planning his complete destruction. The old Jackson, the naive man who believed in honor and loyalty, would have confronted her directly, given her a chance to explain, tried to work things out for the sake of their marriage. That Jackson was dead. The new Jackson, forged in the fires of betrayal and tempered by years of tactical training, began planning his counter-operation. Tasha and Donovan wanted to destroy his life. He would show them what destruction really looked like. First, he needed intelligence on his enemies. Jackson spent the next day researching Donovan Mendoza's background, financial situation, and personal relationships. What he found provided excellent ammunition for the war to come. Donovan was deeply in debt, having lived beyond his means for years. His photography business was failing, his Los Angeles apartment was overpriced, and he owed money to several unsavory creditors. His affair with Tasha wasn't just about passion, it was about financial survival. He saw her as his ticket to a better life, his solution to mounting debt problems. More importantly, Donovan was already married. His wife, Emma Maynard, lived in Los Angeles with their 2 young children. She had no idea her husband was conducting an affair in Chicago, planning to abandon his family for another woman. Emma worked as a nurse, supporting their household, while Donovan pursued his artistic dreams. She was everything Tasha wasn't: loyal, hardworking, devoted to her family. Jackson's plan began crystallizing. Tasha and Donovan wanted to play games. He would show them how a professional conducted psychological warfare. But first, he needed to deal with Eric Cameron. The man's surveillance operation had to end, and Jackson needed those files for his own purposes. Military training had taught him many ways to neutralize threats. Not all of them were legal. Jackson smiled for the first time in 3 days. It wasn't a pleasant expression. When Tasha returned home that evening from another photography class, Jackson was waiting in the living room with a glass of wine and a warm smile. "How was class tonight?" he asked casually. "Oh, the usual. Donovan's really pushing us to explore more challenging techniques." Tasha's lie came easily, practiced after months of deception. "That's wonderful, honey. I'm so glad you found something you're passionate about." Tasha kissed his cheek, the same lips that had been on another man hours earlier. "I'm going to shower. Long day." Jackson watched her go upstairs, noting every detail of her appearance, her demeanor, her casual cruelty. She thought she was winning this game. She had no idea the game had changed. Chapter 4: Gathering Intelligence. Jackson's transformation from trusting husband to tactical operative was swift and complete. Years of military conditioning reasserted themselves with frightening efficiency. By the end of the week, he'd established a command center in his basement workshop, complete with surveillance monitors, communication equipment, and detailed dossiers on his targets. Eric Cameron was his first objective. The false neighbor maintained irregular hours, leaving his house at different times each day, presumably to follow Tasha or gather intelligence on other targets. Jackson needed those surveillance files, and he needed Eric neutralized before the man could report back to Tasha's lawyer. Jackson's opportunity came on a rainy Thursday morning. Eric left his house at 8:30 a.m., following his usual pattern of trailing Tasha to her supposed job at the art gallery. Jackson knew better. Thursday mornings were when Tasha met Donovan at his downtown loft for what she'd told Jackson were advanced composition sessions. Using lock-picking skills acquired during special operations training, Jackson entered Eric's house through the back door. The interior was a monument to paranoid surveillance. Cameras pointing in every direction, recording equipment humming constantly, walls covered with photographs and charts mapping his neighborhood. Jackson found the files he needed in Eric's office. Months of detailed surveillance had produced a comprehensive record of every aspect of their lives. Photos of Bo walking to school, Jackson leaving for work, Tasha's meetings with Donovan, even intimate moments stolen through telephoto lenses. The violation was complete and systematic. But among the surveillance files, Jackson discovered something unexpected, evidence that Eric had been conducting illegal operations for multiple clients. Blackmail schemes, corporate espionage, surveillance of politicians and business leaders. The man wasn't just a private investigator. He was a professional criminal. Jackson photographed everything, then installed his own surveillance devices throughout Eric's house. Miniature cameras and listening devices that would give him complete access to the man's activities. If Eric was planning to expand his operations against Jackson's family, he would see it coming. As Jackson prepared to leave, he heard a car in the driveway. Eric was returning early. Jackson had seconds to disappear before being discovered. He slipped out the back door just as Eric entered through the front, but not before leaving a small surprise in the man's computer system. A virus of Jackson's own design, one that would slowly corrupt Eric's files while sending copies to Jackson's secure servers. Within days, Jackson would own every piece of evidence Eric had collected, and the man wouldn't realize his operation was compromised until it was too late. That afternoon, Jackson received a call that would accelerate his timeline dramatically. "Mr. Vincent? This is Leonore Briggs, attorney at law. I represent your wife in a legal matter. We need to schedule a meeting to discuss your marriage." Jackson's voice remained perfectly calm. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. What legal matter?" "Divorce proceedings, Mr. Vincent. Your wife has retained my services to dissolve your marriage. We'd like to handle this amicably, but we need to discuss asset division and custody arrangements." "I see. When did my wife file these papers?" "Yesterday afternoon. Surely she's discussed this with you." Jackson knew Tasha was at Donovan's loft at that exact moment, planning the destruction of his life while lying naked in another man's bed. The casual cruelty of her timing, filing for divorce while maintaining the pretense of their marriage, revealed depths of callousness that surprised even Jackson's military-hardened perspective. "No, she hasn't mentioned anything. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." "I don't think so, Mr. Vincent. We have substantial evidence documenting the deterioration of your marriage. Your wife has expressed concerns about your stability, your anger issues related to your military service, and her fear for her personal safety." Jackson's grip tightened on the phone. They were already implementing their strategy, painting him as a dangerous veteran to justify their theft of his assets and custody of Bo. "Ms. Briggs, I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about my character and my marriage. I'd be happy to meet with you to clear things up. Of course. How about tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m.? I should warn you, Mr. Vincent, that it would be wise to retain your own counsel. This situation may become complicated." After hanging up, Jackson sat in his basement command center, staring at monitors displaying Eric's house, Donovan's loft, and the law office where his destruction was being planned. The rage was still there, burning cold and steady, but it was controlled now. Focused. Tasha thought she held all the cards. She had her lover, her lawyer, her surveillance evidence, and her strategy to paint Jackson as an unstable veteran. She believed she could take his son, his money, and his reputation while walking away clean. She was about to learn the difference between planning a battle and fighting a war. Jackson opened a secure communications channel he'd established with several former Army colleagues who now worked in the private security sector. Men who understood loyalty, betrayal, and the sometimes necessary overlap between justice and revenge. His first call was to Wade McNeil, his former sergeant and current owner of a private investigation firm that specialized in corporate security and and personal protection. Wade had been in Jackson's unit during both Afghanistan tours, had seen him operate under pressure, knew exactly what kind of man Jackson became when his family was threatened. "Jackson, good to hear from you. How's civilian life treating you?" "I need help, Wade. The kind of help that requires discretion and specialized skills." Wade's tone shifted immediately. "What's the situation?" Jackson outlined the essential facts: the surveillance, the affair, the legal ambush, the plan to steal his son and destroy his reputation. He didn't mention his own surveillance activities or the evidence he'd gathered. "Not yet." "Jesus, Jackson. I'm sorry. That's a hell of a betrayal. I need intelligence on 3 targets. Deep background, financial records, personal vulnerabilities. Everything that could be useful in a counter-operation." "Counter-operation?" "Jackson, be careful here. I know you're angry, but this isn't anger, Wade. This is warfare. They drew first blood. They chose the battlefield. They established the rules of engagement. Now I'm going to finish what they started." Wade was quiet for a long moment. He'd seen Jackson in combat, knew the man's capacity for calculated violence when protecting his people. "What do you need?" "Everything you can find on Donovan Mendoza, Leonore Briggs, and a private investigator named Eric Cameron. Real names, financial records, personal history, criminal background, family connections. I want to know how they breathe. I can have preliminary reports within 48 hours. Full workups by end of week. But Jackson, whatever you're planning, make sure you can live with it afterward." Jackson looked at the surveillance photos scattered across his desk. Images of his wife's betrayal, evidence of their planned destruction of his life, documentation of their callous dismissal of his son's welfare. "I can live with anything, Wade. The question is whether they can." After ending the call, Jackson opened another secure channel. This one connected him to Jeffrey Fry, a former military intelligence specialist who now worked in cybersecurity. If Jackson was going to war, he needed control of the information battlefield. "Jeff, it's Jackson Vincent. I need a favor." "Name it." "How would someone go about making certain digital files disappear completely? And how would someone ensure that any remaining copies couldn't be traced back to their original source?" "That's an interesting question. Hypothetically speaking, of course. Of course. Hypothetically, someone with the right skills could infiltrate target computer systems, corrupt specific files, and redirect any backup systems to secure servers under different ownership. The original owners would discover their files had been compromised, but they'd have no way to recover them or trace who had accessed them. How long would such a hypothetical operation take? For someone with military-grade training and proper resources? Maybe 72 hours to ensure complete control of the target systems. Jackson smiled. "Thanks, Jeff. I may have some hypothetical consulting work for you soon." That evening, Jackson sat across from Tasha at dinner, watching her lie with practiced ease about her day at the gallery, her photography class, her plans for the weekend. She thought she was playing him for a fool, building her case while he remained oblivious to her betrayal. She had no idea that Jackson was building his own case, or that his version of justice would be far more thorough and permanent than anything she could imagine. "How was your day, honey?" Tasha asked, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand with false affection. "Productive," Jackson replied, squeezing back just hard enough to see a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Very productive." Chapter 5, Setting the Snare. Jackson's meeting with Leonore Briggs revealed the full scope of their strategy. The lawyer was confident, almost smug, as she laid out their case against him. They had surveillance evidence of his controlling behavior, testimony about his anger issues, and expert psychological evaluation claiming his military service made him unfit for custody of Beau. "Your wife is concerned about her safety, Mr. Vincent. She's documented instances of verbal abuse, intimidation, and what she describes as cold, calculating stares that make her fear for her well-being." Jackson sat perfectly still, his expression neutral. "I've never raised a hand to my wife. I've never even raised my voice to her. Physical abuse isn't the only form of domestic violence, Mr. Vincent. Psychological intimidation can be just as damaging. Your wife feels trapped in a marriage with a man who uses his military training to maintain control through fear." The effect was exactly what Jackson intended. Tasha became increasingly paranoid, wondering how much Jackson actually knew. She began making mistakes, contradicting her own stories, acting defensively when he asked innocent questions, showing signs of stress that even Donovan noticed. "You seem tense lately," Donovan observed during one of their meetings at his loft. "Is everything okay at home?" "Jackson's been acting strange, asking a lot of questions about my classes, wanting to know details about your teaching methods. It's like he suspects something, but I can't tell how much he knows. Maybe it's time to accelerate our timeline. Get the divorce proceedings moving faster. Leonore says we need to be patient, build the case properly, but I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." What Tasha didn't know was that Jackson was listening to every word through surveillance devices he'd planted in Donovan's loft. Her growing panic was music to his ears. The trap was almost ready. Jackson had gathered his intelligence, identified his enemy's weaknesses, and begun applying pressure at strategic points. Soon, the careful plans of his betrayers would begin unraveling in spectacular fashion, and Jackson would be there to watch every moment of their destruction. Chapter 6. The pressure builds. 3 weeks into Jackson's counter-operation, cracks began appearing in his enemy's carefully laid plans. The psychological pressure he'd been applying was yielding results, and the intelligence network he'd established through Wade and Jeffrey was providing real-time updates on their increasingly desperate situation. Donovan was the first to break. His creditors had grown more aggressive as his debts mounted, and several had made it clear that patience was running out. The stress was affecting his work, his health, and his relationship with Tasha. He'd begun drinking heavily, making careless mistakes, and showing signs of the volatile temperament that had destroyed his previous relationships. Jackson's manipulation of Emma Mendoza was proceeding perfectly. Using his fake online persona, he'd guided her to discover Donovan's hidden credit card statements, unexplained charges from Chicago hotels, and suspicious communications with gallery owners about authentication services. Emma was smart enough to connect the dots herself, but Jackson had ensured she found all the right dots. The breakthrough came when Emma hired her own private investigator to document Donovan's activities in Chicago. The investigator was competent, but unaware he was walking into Jackson's surveillance network. Every move he made, every piece of evidence he gathered, was monitored and recorded by Jackson's systems. When Emma's investigator photographed Donovan and Tasha together at the downtown loft, Jackson knew the critical moment had arrived. Emma would confront her husband within days, and that confrontation would trigger a cascade of consequences that would destroy everyone involved. Meanwhile, Eric Cameron was experiencing his own problems. Jackson's virus had corrupted critical files in his surveillance operation, making his evidence unreliable and his credibility questionable. Worse, anonymous tips had reached federal investigators about his illegal activities, triggering preliminary inquiries that made his clients nervous. Leonore Briggs received a call that would change everything. The State Bar Association had received a complaint about her use of illegally obtained surveillance evidence in divorce proceedings. The complaint was detailed, well-documented, and potentially career-ending. She needed to resolve Tasha's case quickly before her own legal problems made representation impossible. The pressure reached a breaking point on a cold November evening. Jackson was monitoring his surveillance network when Emma's confrontation with Donovan finally occurred. The conversation, captured through devices Jackson had planted in Donovan's loft, was brutal and revealing. "Who is she?" Emma's voice was steady but deadly. "Emma, I can explain. Who is Tasha Vincent? And don't lie to me anymore. I've seen the photos, I've seen the hotel bills, I've seen everything." Jackson smiled as he listened to Donovan's pathetic attempts at denial, followed by partial confessions, followed by desperate bargaining. Emma was magnificent in her cold fury, systematically dismantling every excuse Donovan offered. "You've been stealing from our family to pay for your affair. You've been lying to me for months while I worked extra shifts to support us. You've been planning to abandon your children for another woman. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. And it's worse than I thought. I know about the art fraud, Donovan. I know about the money laundering. I know about all of it." Jackson's enhancement of the evidence had worked perfectly. Emma believed Donovan was a sophisticated criminal rather than a simple adulterer and small-time fraud. Her rage was amplified by the magnitude of his apparent deception. "Emma, please, let me explain." "There's nothing to explain. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow. I'm taking the children. I'm keeping the house. And I'm reporting your criminal activities to every relevant authority." The call ended with Donovan's desperate pleading and Emma's implacable refusal to listen. Within hours, Donovan was on the phone with Tasha, his voice shaking with panic. "We have a problem. A big problem." "What kind of problem?" "Emma knows. She knows everything. She's filing for divorce. She's taking the kids, and she's threatening to expose my business activities." Jackson listened to Tasha's shocked silence, then her rapid-fire questions about how much Emma knew and what it meant for their own plans. "This changes everything," Tasha finally said. "If your wife is exposing you, it could implicate me too. Leonore will have to adjust our strategy. There's more. I think someone's been setting me up. The evidence Emma has is too comprehensive, too perfect. Someone wanted her to find out about us." Jackson's smile widened. Donovan was smarter than he'd given him credit for, but not smart enough to identify the actual threat. "That's paranoid thinking. Who would want to expose us?" "I don't know, but this feels orchestrated. Like someone's been playing a longer game than we realized." Tasha's voice took on an edge of fear. "You think Jackson knows?" "I think Jackson's a lot more dangerous than we gave him credit for." The conversation continued for another hour, with both conspirators growing increasingly paranoid and desperate. Their confidence was evaporating as their carefully laid plans collapsed around them. Jackson's phone rang an hour later. Leonore Briggs, her usual smugness replaced by barely controlled panic. "Mr. Vincent, we need to meet immediately. The situation has changed significantly." "In what way?" "I can't discuss it over the phone. Can you come to my office tonight?" Jackson smiled. "Of course. I'll be there in an hour." The drive to Leonore's office gave Jackson time to review his strategy for the coming confrontation. Everything was proceeding exactly as he'd planned. His enemies were panicking, making mistakes, turning against each other. The psychological pressure was breaking down their coordination and forcing them into increasingly desperate actions. Leonore's office reflected her deteriorating situation. Papers scattered everywhere, empty coffee cups suggesting she'd been working late, and the general disarray of someone struggling to maintain control of a rapidly evolving crisis. "Mr. Vincent, I'm going to be direct. We've encountered some complications that require immediate attention." "What kind of complications?" "The evidence we've been gathering has been compromised. Our investigators' files have been corrupted, and there are questions about the legality of his surveillance methods." Jackson maintained an expression of concerned confusion. "I'm not sure I understand. Frankly, neither do I. But federal investigators are asking questions about our evidence-gathering techniques, and I can't risk my license by proceeding with questionable materials." "So what does this mean for my wife's case?" Leonore hesitated, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. "We may need to pursue a different strategy, one that doesn't rely on surveillance evidence." "Ms. Briggs, I think you should know that I've become aware of some disturbing information about my wife's activities." Leonore's head snapped up. "What kind of information?" Jackson opened the briefcase he'd brought and removed a folder containing carefully selected photographs and documents. Not the surveillance evidence Eric had gathered, but materials from his own investigation that painted an equally damning picture of Tasha's betrayal. "It appears my wife has been conducting an affair with her photography instructor. This evidence came to my attention through entirely legal means: social media posts, public records, and information provided by concerned third parties." Leonore examined the documents, her face growing pale as she realized the implications. Her client's narrative about being trapped in an abusive marriage was contradicted by evidence of her own infidelity and deception. "Where did you get this?" "Does it matter? The question is whether this changes your assessment of my wife's legal position." Leonore set the documents down with trembling hands. Her case was evaporating before her eyes. Without the surveillance evidence, she had no way to prove Jackson's supposed abuse. With evidence of Tasha's affair, any sympathy a judge might have had for her client would disappear. "Mr. Vincent, perhaps we should discuss an alternative arrangement, something that would be mutually beneficial and avoid the complications of a contested divorce." Jackson leaned back in his chair, enjoying the moment. "I'm listening. Your wife is willing to accept a much more modest settlement. Perhaps a simple division of assets, no alimony, and shared custody arrangements." "That's interesting. Last week, you were telling me about her fears for her safety and her need for protection from my allegedly abusive behavior." Leonore's composure cracked completely. "The situation has evolved. New information has come to light that changes our understanding of the marriage dynamics." Jackson stood slowly, gathering his documents. "Ms. Briggs, I think my wife's situation is about to become much more complicated than either of you anticipated. I suggest you prepare for that reality." He left Leonore's office knowing that panic would soon spread to Tasha. The psychological pressure was working exactly as he'd planned. His enemies were turning against each other. Their coordination was breaking down, and their confidence was shattered. But Jackson wasn't finished. The real destruction was just beginning. Chapter 7. The Trap Springs. The next morning brought Emma Mendoza's first move in what would become a devastating assault on Donovan's life. Jackson watched through his surveillance network as federal agents raided Donovan's Chicago loft, armed with search warrants based on Emma's complaints about art fraud and money laundering. The evidence Jackson had planted months earlier was discovered exactly as planned. Donovan's computers contained detailed records of fraudulent authentication certificates, financial transactions with known money launderers, and communications with buyers who'd been defrauded of millions of dollars. The case against him was overwhelming and undeniable, but the raid served Jackson's purposes beyond simply destroying Donovan. When federal agents seized the loft's contents, they discovered Tasha's personal belongings scattered throughout the apartment: clothing, jewelry, photographs, and other evidence of her extended stays. The affair that was supposed to remain secret became part of a federal criminal investigation. Jackson monitored police communications as agents interviewed neighbors who confirmed seeing a woman matching Tasha's description entering and leaving the loft regularly. Security cameras from nearby buildings provided additional footage of their meetings. Within hours, Tasha's involvement with Donovan was documented in federal files. The psychological impact on Tasha was immediate and devastating. She called Jackson from the art gallery, her voice shaking with barely controlled panic. "Jackson, something terrible has happened. Donovan's been arrested." "Arrested? For what?" "Some kind of fraud investigation. Federal agents raided his apartment this morning." Jackson let appropriate shock and concern color his voice. "My God, Tasha, are you okay?" I might be implicated. I've been to his apartment several times for photography sessions. The agents might think I was involved in whatever he was doing." Jackson smiled at the beautiful irony. Tasha was confessing to the affair while trying to minimize her involvement, unaware that her lover's apartment was wired with Jackson's surveillance equipment and that every word she spoke was being recorded. "Honey, if you're innocent of any wrongdoing, you have nothing to worry about. Truth has a way of coming to light." "Jackson, there's something I need to tell you. Let's talk when you get home. This sounds like something we should discuss in person." Jackson's dismissal was calculated to increase Tasha's anxiety. She needed to confess, to unburden herself of the guilt and fear that was consuming her, but he was forcing her to carry that burden until evening. The psychological pressure would build throughout the day, making her increasingly desperate and likely to make mistakes. Meanwhile, Jackson received updates from Wade's surveillance team monitoring the federal investigation. Donovan was being held without bail, facing charges that could result in decades in prison. His financial assets were frozen, his business relationships destroyed, his reputation annihilated. The man who'd planned to steal Jackson's wife and destroy his family was now facing complete personal destruction. More importantly, Donovan was talking to investigators. Desperate to reduce his own charges, he was providing information about everyone he'd worked with, including gallery owners, collectors, and other conspirators in his fraud schemes. He hadn't mentioned Tasha yet, but Jackson knew it was only a matter of time before desperate self-preservation overcame any loyalty to his lover. That afternoon brought another piece of excellent news. Eric Cameron's criminal activities had attracted serious federal attention, triggered by the anonymous tips Jackson had provided. A joint FBI-RS investigation had uncovered evidence of blackmail, illegal surveillance, tax evasion, and money laundering. Eric was arrested at his house, the fake neighbor's residence that had started Jackson's journey into this war. Jackson recognized the strategy. They were turning his greatest strengths, his protective instincts, his tactical mindset, his disciplined behavior, into weapons against him. In their narrative, his love for his family became obsessive control. His careful planning became sinister manipulation. His military service became a liability rather than an honor. "Ms. Briggs, I think you've been given some very inaccurate information about my character and my marriage." "Have I?" "Your wife has documented your behavior extensively. We have witnesses who can testify to your intimidating presence, your suspicious monitoring of her activities, your demands for detailed accounts of her whereabouts. Jackson almost laughed. They were describing his recent surveillance activities, behavior that had started only after Beau's discovery at Eric's house. They were using his investigation of their betrayal as evidence of the controlling behavior that supposedly justified their betrayal in the first place. "I'd like to see this evidence," Jackson said calmly. "In due time. For now, we're prepared to offer a reasonable settlement. Your wife doesn't want to destroy you, Mr. Vincent. She simply wants her freedom." Leonor slid a document across the table. Jackson scanned it quickly, his military training allowing him to absorb the details while maintaining an expression of calm interest. They wanted 70% of his assets, including the house, his retirement accounts, and ongoing alimony for 5 years. They wanted sole custody of Beau, with Jackson limited to supervised visits every other weekend. They wanted him to agree to anger management counseling and psychological evaluation as conditions of any contact with his son. "This is quite generous, considering the circumstances," Leonor continued. "If we proceed to court, the outcome could be much less favorable for you. Judges take domestic violence very seriously, especially when veterans are involved." Jackson set the document down carefully. "I'll need time to review this with my own attorney." "Of course, but don't take too long, Mr. Vincent. Your wife is anxious to move forward with her life. She's been suffering in silence for too long." That evening, Jackson received the preliminary reports from Wade's investigation. The information exceeded his expectations and provided perfect ammunition for the next phase of his operation. Donovan Mendoza was drowning in debt. Credit cards, personal loans, outstanding payments to vendors, legal fees from a business dispute. He owed over $200,000 to various creditors. Several of these creditors had ties to organized crime, having purchased his debts from legitimate collection agencies. If Donovan didn't produce payments soon, his problems would become physical. More importantly, Donovan's wife Emma had no idea about his financial situation or his affair. She believed her husband was in Chicago temporarily, teaching photography workshops to save money for their family's future. She'd been picking up extra nursing shifts to support their household while Donovan was away, building his career. Leonor Briggs had her own vulnerabilities. Her law practice was struggling, and she'd been taking increasingly questionable cases to maintain her lifestyle. She'd been disciplined twice by the state bar for ethical violations, and another complaint could result in suspension of her license. She needed Tasha's case to succeed. Her fees were contingent on winning a substantial settlement. Eric Cameron's criminal activities extended far beyond private investigation. He was running blackmail operations against prominent citizens, selling corporate secrets to competitors, and providing illegal surveillance services to divorce attorneys throughout the region. A single anonymous tip to federal authorities would trigger investigations that would send him to prison for decades. Jackson studied the reports, cross-referencing information and identifying pressure points. His enemies thought they held all the power, but they built their strategy on foundations of sand. A few carefully placed pressures would bring their entire operation crashing down. But Jackson wasn't interested in merely defending himself. He wanted total victory, complete destruction of everyone who had betrayed him or threatened his family. The kind of overwhelming defeat that would serve as a permanent lesson about the consequences of crossing Jackson Vincent. His first move was elegant in its simplicity. Using Jeffrey Fry's cybersecurity skills, Jackson infiltrated Donovan's computer systems and discovered something beautiful: detailed financial records of the man's illegal activities. Donovan had been running a sophisticated fraud operation for months, selling falsified artwork authentication certificates to wealthy collectors. He'd authenticated fake paintings, sculptures, and photographs, earning substantial fees while helping dealers defraud buyers of millions of dollars. The evidence was meticulously documented in files Donovan thought were secure. Jackson copied everything, then planted additional evidence suggesting Donovan had been skimming money from his authentication fees. He created a trail of financial transactions that implicated Donovan in money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The evidence was circumstantial but convincing, and it painted Donovan as far more sophisticated criminal than he actually was. Next, Jackson turned his attention to Emma Mendoza. The woman deserved to know about her husband's betrayal, but Jackson needed her discovery to serve his larger strategy. He couldn't simply send her the surveillance photos. That would be too obviously malicious. Instead, Jackson created a fake social media account and began building a connection with Emma through nursing forums and professional networks. Over several weeks, he established himself as a concerned friend who had noticed troubling information about her husband's activities in Chicago. The revelation would come slowly, naturally, as if Emma were discovering it herself. Jackson would guide her investigation, provide her with resources, and ensure she uncovered not just the affair, but Donovan's criminal activities and financial deception. When Emma acted on this information, it would appear to be her own initiative rather than Jackson's manipulation. Meanwhile, Jackson began his psychological campaign against Tasha. Nothing obvious, nothing she could document or report. Just small changes in his behavior that would slowly erode her confidence and increase her stress. He became unpredictably supportive, praising her photography work and encouraging her to spend more time on her artistic development. He bought her expensive equipment, enrolled her in advanced classes, and insisted she pursue her passion with complete dedication. His sudden enthusiasm for her supposed hobby created cognitive dissonance that left her constantly off balance. At the same time, Jackson began demonstrating subtle awareness of her deception without directly confronting it. He would mention her photography teacher by name, ask detailed questions about techniques she claimed to be learning, and reference locations where her classes supposedly took place. Each conversation made it clear that Jackson was paying far more attention to her activities than she'd realized. The arrest eliminated Jackson's most dangerous enemy. Eric possessed surveillance evidence that could have complicated Jackson's plans, but now that evidence was in federal custody and inadmissible in any civil proceedings. Moreover, Eric's arrest for serious federal crimes destroyed his credibility as a witness or investigator. Leonore Briggs received the news about her investigator's arrest with the kind of panic Jackson had been hoping to see. Her entire case against Jackson had been built on Eric's surveillance evidence, and now that evidence was not only unusable, but potentially criminal. Worse, her association with Eric was drawing attention from the State Bar Association's ethics investigators. Jackson's phone rang that evening as he prepared for Tasha's return home. "Mr. Vincent, this is Leonore Briggs. We have an emergency situation." "What kind of emergency?" "Our investigator has been arrested on federal charges. The evidence we've been using in your case may have been obtained illegally. We need to withdraw all our previous claims and start over." Jackson let silence stretch for a long moment. "Ms. Briggs, are you telling me that you've been threatening me with evidence that was obtained through criminal activity?" We had no knowledge of any illegal activity. We hired what we believed was a legitimate private investigator. This is very concerning. I think I'll need to discuss this situation with my own attorney, and possibly with the State Bar Association." "Mr. Vincent, please. Perhaps we can reach an accommodation that serves everyone's interests." "I'm sure we can, but it will be on my terms, not yours." Jackson ended the call knowing that Leonore's career was effectively over. Her association with criminal investigators, combined with her use of illegally obtained evidence, would result in disciplinary action that would end her law practice. She was no longer a threat, she was a casualty. When Tasha arrived home that evening, Jackson was waiting in the living room with a glass of wine and an expression of concerned sympathy. He'd spent the day preparing for this confrontation, knowing it would be the beginning of the end for his unfaithful wife. "Jackson, we need to talk." "Of course. Come sit down. You look upset." Tasha perched on the edge of the sofa, her body language revealing the stress and guilt that had been building all day. "I've been lying to you about something, and I can't keep it secret anymore." Jackson reached over and took her hand, the gesture of a supportive husband. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it together. I haven't been taking photography classes. I've been having an affair with Donovan Mendoza." Jackson's expression shifted through surprise, hurt, and finally resignation, a performance worthy of an Academy Award. "How long?" 3 months. "I'm so sorry, Jackson. I never meant for this to happen." 3 months. Jackson let the words hang in the air, watching Tasha flinch at the pain in his voice. "And now he's been arrested for fraud. I had no idea about any criminal activity. I thought he was just a photography instructor." Jackson nodded slowly, as if processing this information for the first time. "Tasha, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Have you been planning to leave me?" The question hit Tasha like a physical blow. Her face went white as she realized how much Jackson might know about her plans. We talked about it. About maybe starting over together. And what about Bo? What were your plans regarding my son? Jackson, please. What about Bo? His voice carried an edge of steel that made Tasha shrink back. I thought maybe it would be better if he stayed with you. I know how much you love him. Jackson stood slowly, walking to the window that faced Eric's house. So you were planning to take half my assets, collect alimony for years, and abandon the boy you've helped raise for 5 years. It wasn't like that. Jackson turned back to face her, and Tasha saw something in his eyes that made her realize the scope of her mistake. This wasn't the shocked, hurt husband she'd expected. This was something far more dangerous. Actually, Tasha, it was exactly like that. You hired a lawyer. You hired an investigator to spy on me. You planned to claim I was abusive, unstable, unfit to raise my own son. You were going to destroy my reputation, steal my assets, and abandon my child to start a new life with your criminal lover. Tasha's mouth opened in shock. How do I know? Because I'm not the fool you thought I was. Because I spent 20 years learning how to gather intelligence and neutralize threats. Because you underestimated exactly who you were betraying. Jackson walked closer, and Tasha instinctively backed toward the door. Jackson, I can explain. There's nothing to explain. You made your choices. You declared war on my family. Now you get to live with the consequences. What are you going to do? Jackson's smile was cold and absolutely without mercy. I'm going to show you what happens when someone betrays Jackson Vincent. And Tasha, it's going to be much worse than anything you planned for me. Chapter 8. The Destruction. The next 72 hours saw the systematic annihilation of everyone who had conspired against Jackson Vincent. Years of military planning combined with months of careful preparation created a cascade of destruction that left his enemies powerless to defend themselves. Donovan Mendoza's situation deteriorated first. Under pressure from federal investigators and facing decades in prison, he attempted to negotiate a plea deal by providing information about other criminals in his network. But Jackson had anticipated this move, and the information Donovan provided had been carefully manipulated. Unknown to Donovan, Jackson had spent weeks creating false evidence linking him to organized crime figures in Los Angeles. Bank records showed payments from known money launderers, phone records revealed communications with suspected criminals, and forensic accounting demonstrated financial relationships with dangerous people. When Donovan began cooperating with federal investigators, he unknowingly implicated himself in crimes he'd never committed but couldn't prove he hadn't. The fictional criminal network Jackson had created around him was so sophisticated and believable that even Donovan began to doubt his own memories. Worse, Donovan's cooperation angered the actual criminals he'd supposedly betrayed. Men who'd never heard of Donovan Mendoza suddenly found federal investigators asking questions about their relationship with him. These men didn't appreciate the attention, and they made their displeasure known in ways that federal witness protection couldn't prevent. Jackson monitored Donovan's deteriorating situation through contacts in federal law enforcement. The man was trapped in a prison system where his supposed cooperation with authorities made him a target, while his alleged connections to organized crime made protective custody impossible. Every day brought new threats, new fears, new evidence of crimes he couldn't explain. Emma Mendoza's divorce proceedings against her husband became a public spectacle as media coverage focused on the art fraud scandal. Every detail of Donovan's deception was exposed, including his affair with Tasha and his abandonment of his family. Emma received overwhelming public sympathy as the loyal wife betrayed by her criminal husband. But Jackson's manipulation of Emma went beyond simply destroying Donovan. Using his fake online persona, he continued to feed her information about her husband's supposed criminal activities, encouraging her to pursue civil litigation against everyone connected to Donovan's fraud schemes. This led Emma to file lawsuits against galleries, collectors, and anyone who'd profited from Donovan's authentication services. Among the targets was the art gallery where Tasha supposedly worked, a connection that brought Tasha into the legal proceedings as a potential co-conspirator. Tasha found herself named in multiple lawsuits, facing depositions about her relationship with Donovan and her knowledge of his criminal activities. The financial pressure was enormous, the public humiliation devastating, and the legal jeopardy very real. Leonore Briggs's career imploded even faster than Jackson had anticipated. The State Bar Association's investigation into her use of illegally obtained evidence resulted in an immediate suspension of her license. Her association with Eric Cameron's criminal activities triggered additional investigations into every case she'd handled over the past 3 years. Within a week, Leonore faced ethics charges, potential criminal prosecution for conspiracy to commit illegal surveillance, and civil lawsuits from clients whose cases had been contaminated by her illegal methods. Her law practice collapsed, her assets were frozen, and her reputation was destroyed beyond recovery. But Jackson's most devastating move was yet to come. Using intelligence gathered from months of surveillance, Jackson revealed to Tasha the true scope of her situation. Not only was she facing federal investigation, civil lawsuits, and public humiliation, but Jackson had documented evidence of her participation in financial fraud. During their marriage, Tasha had convinced Jackson to invest in several art pieces that Donovan had authenticated. Unknown to Jackson at the time, these were part of Donovan's fraud scheme, and Tasha had received substantial kickbacks for steering her husband toward these purchases. Jackson had been defrauded of nearly $500,000, and Tasha was a willing participant in the scheme. Jackson presented this evidence to federal investigators, portraying himself as another victim of his wife's criminal conspiracy with Donovan. The evidence was overwhelming and indisputable, placing Tasha at the center of a sophisticated fraud operation. "You stole from me," Jackson told Tasha during their final confrontation. "You didn't just betray our marriage. You stole money from our family to fund your affair." Tasha's protestations of innocence were meaningless. The evidence showed her receiving payments, steering Jackson toward specific purchases, and coordinating with Donovan to maximize the fraud. Whether she'd understood the full scope of the scheme was irrelevant. She'd participated willingly and profited substantially. "Jackson, please. I'll do anything to make this right." "There is no making this right. You chose to destroy our family. You chose to steal from me. You chose to plan my destruction. Now you get to live with those choices." Jackson filed for divorce on grounds of adultery and fraud, seeking full custody of Beau and complete forfeiture of Tasha's assets as restitution for her theft. The legal papers were served while Tasha was meeting with federal investigators about her role in Donovan's criminal enterprise. The timing was calculated for maximum psychological impact. Tasha realized that Jackson hadn't just discovered her betrayal. He'd been planning his revenge for months. Every conversation, every gesture of support, every moment of apparent normalcy had been part of his strategy to destroy her completely. "You knew," she whispered when Jackson picked up Beau from school that afternoon. "You knew everything." "I knew enough," Jackson replied calmly. "I knew you were a cheating thief who planned to destroy my family. I knew you needed to be stopped." "What about Beau? What did you tell him?" Jackson's expression hardened. "I told him the truth. That you're a criminal who stole from our family and abandoned him for another man. He's old enough to understand what that means." The revelation devastated Tasha. Beau's rejection of her was complete and absolute. The boy she'd helped raise for 5 years now looked at her with the same cold contempt his father displayed. She'd lost not just her marriage and her freedom, but any claim to the family she'd spent years building. "Jackson, please. Have mercy." "Mercy?" Jackson's voice was filled with genuine incredulity. "You planned to steal my son, my money, and my reputation. You hired criminals to spy on me. You painted me as an abusive husband to justify your theft. And now you want mercy?" Jackson leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that chilled Tasha to her bones. "I told you once that I never forgive or forget anyone who betrays me. You should have listened." The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal. Jackson's evidence of Tasha's adultery and criminal activity made her legal position hopeless. She received nothing: no assets, no alimony, no custody rights. She was ordered to pay restitution for the money she'd stolen and faced federal charges that could result in years in prison. Within 6 months, Tasha's life was completely destroyed. Her criminal conviction resulted in a 3-year prison sentence. Her civil liability exceeded her ability to pay, leaving her bankrupt and homeless upon release. Her relationship with Beau was severed permanently. The boy refused any contact with the woman who'd betrayed his father and stolen from their family. Donovan fared even worse. His federal conviction on fraud charges resulted in a 15-year prison sentence. His divorce from Emma left him with crushing financial obligations he could never meet. His reputation in the art world was destroyed, ensuring he'd never work in his field again. But the worst part of Donovan's punishment was the knowledge that he'd been outmaneuvered completely. Jackson Vincent had orchestrated every aspect of his destruction, from the initial discovery of the affair to the final federal conviction. Donovan had thought he was playing a simple game of adultery and divorce. Instead, he'd walked into a war planned by a professional soldier. As Jackson tucked Bo into bed one night, 6 months after Tasha's conviction, his son asked the question Jackson had been expecting. "Dad, do you miss her?" Jackson considered his answer carefully. "I miss the woman I thought she was. But that woman never existed. The real Tasha was someone who could steal from us and abandon you without a second thought. Are you glad she's gone?" Jackson looked at his son, bright, perceptive, resilient despite everything he'd endured. "I'm glad we learned who she really was before she could hurt us any worse. Will you ever forgive her?" Jackson's answer was immediate and absolute. "No. Some betrayals can't be forgiven. Some people don't deserve second chances. Your stepmother made her choices, and now she lives with the consequences." Bo nodded solemnly, accepting this harsh lesson about loyalty, betrayal, and justice. Jackson knew the boy would carry these lessons for the rest of his life, would understand that some lines could never be crossed without permanent consequences. Chapter 9. No Forgiveness. 2 years after Tasha's conviction, Jackson Vincent had rebuilt his life into something stronger and more secure than before. Bo, now 11, had adapted remarkably well to their changed circumstances, showing the resilience that Jackson recognized from his own military background. The boy excelled in school, participated in sports, and showed no lingering trauma from his stepmother's betrayal. Jackson had used the insurance money from recovering his stolen assets to establish a college fund for Bo and invest in a small security consulting firm with Wade McNeil. Their business specialized in corporate investigations and personal protection, drawing on their military experience and Jackson's proven ability to uncover deception and neutralize threats. The house on Maple Street had been sold, and they'd moved to a larger property outside the city. Jackson wanted distance from the memories and the neighbors who'd witnessed their family's destruction. The new house had better security, more privacy, and space for Bo to grow up without constant reminders of their past. Eric Cameron's house had been seized by federal authorities and eventually demolished. The lot remained empty, a reminder of how thoroughly Jackson had eliminated the threat to his family. Neighborhood rumors suggested the property was cursed, but Jackson knew better. It was simply a monument to what happened when someone threatened Jackson Vincent's family. The anniversary of Tasha's conviction passed without acknowledgement from either Jackson or Bo. They'd moved beyond marking time by her betrayal and focused instead on building their future together. Jackson's security business was thriving, partly due to referrals from law enforcement agencies who'd been impressed by his investigative work during the Donovan Mendoza case. His ability to gather intelligence, build comprehensive cases, and orchestrate complex operations made him valuable to clients facing sophisticated threats. But Jackson's reputation extended beyond his professional capabilities. Word had spread through certain circles about what happened to people who betrayed or threatened the Vincent family. The story of Tasha's complete destruction served as a cautionary tale that protected Jackson and Bo from future predators. On a cold December evening, Jackson was reviewing case files in his home office when Bo appeared in the doorway with an expression that reminded Jackson of the day this all began. The day Bo had warned him about Thaddeus Pollard's house. "Dad, I need to tell you something." Jackson set aside his work, giving Bo his complete attention. "What's on your mind?" "I got a letter today. From her." Jackson's expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened. "From Tasha? She wants to see me. Says she's getting out of prison soon and wants to make things right." Jackson studied his son's face, looking for signs of confusion or conflicted emotions. Instead, he saw the same cold calculation that had served the Vincent family so well over the past 2 years. "What do you want to do?" Bo's answer was immediate and unequivocal. "Nothing. I don't want to see her. I don't want to talk to her. I don't want her in our lives." Jackson felt a surge of pride at his son's clarity and strength. "Are you sure? It's okay if you have complicated feelings about this. She stole from us. She lied to us. She tried to destroy our family. Bo's voice carried the same unwavering conviction that Jackson had demonstrated throughout their ordeal. Some things can't be forgiven. Jackson nodded approvingly. Some things can't be forgiven, he agreed. Over the following weeks, Tasha made several attempts to contact them through intermediaries. Social workers, family counselors, and even some of Bo's teachers suggested that reconciliation might be beneficial for the boy's emotional development. Jackson listened politely to their recommendations, then ignored them completely. She's his stepmother, one particularly persistent counselor argued. Children need closure, need to understand that people can change and grow. She was never his mother in any way that mattered, Jackson replied calmly. She was a criminal who lived in our house and stole from our family. When she was no longer useful to her plans, she was prepared to abandon him completely. That's not a relationship worth preserving. But forgiveness. Forgiveness is earned through genuine remorse and changed behavior over time, neither of which applies here. Tasha is only reaching out now because she's facing the reality of life after prison with no money, no prospects, and no family. She wants to use Bo's emotions to manipulate her way back into our lives. Jackson's assessment proved accurate when Tasha's next contact attempt came through a lawyer specializing in family reconciliation. The lawyer's letter suggested that Tasha was seeking financial support and housing assistance, claiming she deserved help from the family she'd once been part of. Jackson's response was swift and final. He had Tasha served with a restraining order prohibiting any contact with Bo or himself. The order was accompanied by a detailed legal memorandum outlining her criminal history, her theft from their family, and her abandonment of her parental responsibilities. The message was clear. Any attempt to re-enter their lives would be met with the full force of Jackson's considerable resources and capabilities. 6 months later, Jackson received word through Wade's intelligence network that Tasha had died in a car accident while driving under the influence. She'd been living in a homeless shelter, working minimum-wage jobs, and struggling with alcohol addiction since her release from prison. Jackson felt no satisfaction in her death, but also no sadness. Tasha had chosen her path years ago when she decided to betray her family for temporary passion and financial gain. Every consequence that followed, including her final self-destruction, stemmed from that original choice. When Bo heard the news, he asked only one question. Does this change anything? No, Jackson replied. Dead or alive, she's not part of our family anymore. Jackson never remarried. He'd learned too much about the capacity for betrayal to risk his heart or his family's security again. Bo grew up understanding that love and loyalty were precious gifts that could be withdrawn permanently if abused. As Bo entered high school, he began showing interest in following his father's path into military service. Jackson supported this choice while teaching his son the same lessons that had served him so well: loyalty above all else, trust carefully given and never forgotten when broken, and the absolute necessity of protecting family from those who would do them harm. On Bo's 16th birthday, Jackson gave him a gift that summarized everything he'd learned about life, loyalty, and justice: a simple steel bracelet engraved with 4 words that had become the Vincent family motto. Never forgive, never forget. Bo understood the weight of those words and the responsibility they carried. He'd seen what happened when someone betrayed the Vincent family. He'd watched his father methodically destroy every enemy who'd threatened them. He'd learned that some violations of trust could never be healed, some betrayals could never be forgiven. As Jackson watched his son mature into a young man of unwavering principles and absolute loyalty, he knew that the lessons of Tasha's betrayal had been learned completely. The Vincent family would never again be vulnerable to the kind of destruction that predators like Tasha, Donovan, and their enablers represented. Jackson Vincent had kept his word. He'd never forgiven the people who betrayed him, and he'd never forgotten the lessons their destruction taught. Those lessons would protect his family for generations to come, ensuring that the price of betraying a Vincent would always be complete and permanent destruction. In the end, justice had been served. Not the imperfect justice of courts and laws, but the absolute justice of consequences matching choices. Jackson had given his enemies exactly what they'd tried to give him: total annihilation of everything they valued. The difference was that Jackson's enemies had earned their fate through betrayal and theft, while Jackson had earned his victory through loyalty and strength. Some scales could only be balanced with blood. Some debts could only be paid with destruction. Some betrayals could only be answered with the complete elimination of those who committed them. Jackson Vincent slept peacefully every night, knowing he'd protected his family from predators and taught his son the lessons that would keep the next generation safe. He would never forgive. He would never forget. And neither would his son. The Vincent family legacy was secure. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.